Hi, I'm Owen Casey Stevens, and this is a story of the tale of two cakes. I like cake, which is not really a shock to anyone that knows me, and my interest in cake really started very, very early with me. So by the time I was 9 or 10-year-old, I was looking at cooking cakes for myself and for my family, which my mother allowed as long as she was in the house. Didn't have to be in the kitchen, just nearby, so that if I caused a problem or if I got confused or if I started a fire, which thankfully I never did while baking cakes, she'd be around to assist. One of the very earliest cakes I decided to do on my own, I wanted to make a coffee cake. And I very specifically wanted to bake it in a big curved metal bowl rather than a series of cake pans, so it would be a big dome. And this was during a time which a lot of people were talking about how great it was when you put Jell-O pudding mix in a cake. And so I was doing this largely from scratch. I had a joy of cooking open, and I was sort of looking at different recipes and guessing what sort of stuff to put in it, which sort of works when you're baking if you know the basics. And I decided that I really wanted to have some real fruit flavor in this particular cake. And so I looked to see if we had any fruit-flavored pudding, and we did not, but we did have orange Jell-O, which of course comes as a powder. It was instant Jell-O, and I thought pudding goes well in a cake, so why not Jell-O? I wasn't going to gel it or chill it, just put it in the mix and bake it. So I did, and I put it in the oven, and it baked, and everyone in the family noted that it smelled very, very fruity and light and interesting, and I got it out, and I popped it out of the bowl, and it was, unsurprisingly, bright orange. It was also spongy. It had almost exactly the consistency of a damp sponge, and it had very large grain of air bubbles on the inside, and the outer layer of it had crusted a bit, so it was sort of self-frosted. And whenever I cut it, it made a noise like, and when eating it, you very much got a. That said, the cake did not go to waste. The whole family agreed that it was sort of ridiculous to have put Jell-O in a cake, but it wasn't bad. It was a reasonably tasty coffee cake. Now, that's not an experiment that I ever tried to duplicate, even at that age, but it did put me in a mood to continue to experiment with cakes. A few years after that, and this is the second cake in the Tale of Two Cakes, my sister and I, my sister being a little older than I am, decided that we were going to make a cake for my mother's birthday to surprise her with. And we had the buy-in of my grandmother, whose house was within walking distance of ours, so it seemed reasonable for us to make a chocolate cake. And my mother made the mistake of telling us that it would not be possible for us to make a two-chocolate cake. A cake that was too chocolatey for her was not possible, she said. So we started with the chocolate cake mix, and then we put chocolate actual pudding this time in it. And then we put chocolate chips in the cake mix, and then we baked a 2-layer cake. And then we made a batch of fudge, thick, homemade fudge. And when the cake came out and had cooled, instead of icing it, we covered it in fudge. We put a fudge layer between the two layers of cake. We covered the outside in fudge. Because we were not yet satisfied, we then unwrapped a large number of Hershey's Kisses and ringed the outside of the cake with Hershey's Kisses, probably 3, maybe 4 tiers high. It wasn't perfectly symmetrical. So it had sort of this spiked band of actual solid chocolate. And then we put York peppermint patties across the top. Now, if we had done all this, say, the day that we were serving this cake to my mother, perhaps everything would have been fine, but we were aware that fudge takes some time to set. This was at my grandmother's house, where we would be having my mother over for dinner in a few days. So we stuck it in the refrigerator, covered in my grandmother's cake topper, and left it there for 2 days. And then the family came over, and we all had dinner, and it was lovely. And then we brought out this solid block of candy-covered fudge, which happened to have some cake on the inside. And everyone oohed and awed, and they were very impressed that the two kids had made this cake. And then we got out a knife, and we dented the edge of the fudge very, very lightly with the knife. And then we sort of tried to press the tip down, and that wouldn't work. And then we sort of tried to saw it back and forth. And between the frozen nature of this thing and having been put at the back of the refrigerator for 2 days, and the fact that the frosting layer was actually about an inch of fudge, we were not, and that it had candy on top of that, including just chocolate on the sides. We weren't making a dent in this thing. I recall us trying a bread knife because it was serrated. We thought that might work. We tried a cleaver because it had weight to it, and we thought maybe that would work. As it happens, at this time, my grandmother had living in her spare little cabin. There was sort of a mother-in-law plan, but she had living back there a student who also did housework, and he was exchanging housework on her house for rent for that little apartment back there. So upon seeing that we were having no, and we had him over for dinner, and upon seeing that he was having no luck whatsoever getting into this cake, he went and got a brand new blade for his reciprocating saw, and cleaned it to my grandmother's satisfaction and plugged it in. And he used his reciprocating saw to start slicing wedges of this incredibly dense fudge puck. And he cut a couple slices, and we all had some, and we agreed it was wonderful. But we also agreed the first slice he'd done was a fair-sized slice, and no one could eat that much. So we knew we had to slice this thing now because we didn't want to get a reciprocating saw out every time anyone wanted a piece. So he finished cutting it, doing them one Hershey's Kiss wide slices, and then there's sort of a little chocolate mess in the middle because the tips didn't all neatly meet together. And those were divided up and wrapped in foil and put in the back of the freezer because my family had a tendency to wrap cake in foil when we weren't done eating it and put it in the back of the freezer. Several pieces of that cake were eaten over the next month or two, and we all agreed it was delicious. And thankfully, my mother marked such things with a permanent marker. But our freezer was not a neatly organized environment, and as new things were put in, things might get pushed further and further to the back. So I happen to recall that 2 years after we had done this, while we were cleaning out the freezer, we found a couple slices of this cake wrapped in foil, carefully dated from the summer 2 years earlier, and we thought, it's fudge, it's in the freezer, maybe it's still good. There was a little bit of freezer burn on the actual cake part, which we ended up having to cut free and dismiss, and maybe just a little bit on the fudge, but for the most part, it turns out that fudge and Hershey's Kisses and peppermint patties and a little bit of actual cake survived quite well in the freezer, wrapped in foil for 2 years, and it was quite tasty. So I have, for the most part, not ever attempted to duplicate that feat either. Once I've done a ridiculous thing with a cake, I'm, for the most part, satisfied. I have, in recent years, attempted to make pie-cakins, which is a series of cookies that are stuffed inside a pie that is itself stuffed inside a cake. I even brought one to a Christmas gathering of game designers here in Seattle, and I took one to Paizo one year. But that's a lot of work, and I'm probably not going to try those again. So those are my best cake stories all compiled together into one tale of two cakes. Thanks.